This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, and our guests are Horacio Verbitsky, an Argentine investigative journalist for the newspaper Página 12, or Page 12. He has reported extensively on the church's involvement in Argentina with the military junta that once ruled Argentina, specifically on the role of Father Bergoglio, who is now Pope Francis. Among his books, The Silence, From Paul VI to Bergoglio, The Secret Relations Between the Church and the ESMA. ESMA refers to the former Navy school that was turned into a detention center where people were tortured. Verbitsky also heads the Center for Legal and Social Studies, an Argentine human rights organization. You can also go to our website at democracynow.org, where we broadcast from Buenos Aires several years ago, talking about these issues, including the children who were taken from dissidents who were then killed and handed to military families to be raised, which we'll talk about. Ernesto Seman is with us as well. Seman, the historian at New York University, former reporter for the Argentine newspapers Página 12 and Clarín, where he reported on politics and human rights, as well as Father Bergoglio. As we continue this conversation, Ernesto Seman, can you underscore what Horacio is saying, what you think we know at this point about Pope Francis, what we don't?
Yeah, I think that what Horacio Verbitsky wrote during these several years is trying to uncover what is this kind of social conservatism that you were trying to describe at the beginning of the program. It's not in terms of the discourse, it's not the kind of Catholic conservatism that you're going to find in the United States, with this emphasis in the individual salvation and government crushing individual liberty and economic activity, and it's much more socially loaded. But the paradox, and I think that's the most important point of Horacio Verbitsky's work, is how this same discourse, with a lot of emphasis on social justice and equality, at the same time has worked to undermine the work who had tried to solve those same problems. The case of this complicity of Bergoglio with human rights violation during the dictatorship is by far the most important episode. But during the last decade, he did, as the State Department implicitly suggests, the opposition to the government in a decade in which Argentina lived the largest and fastest reduction of poverty and inequality, as in most of other Latin American countries. So that kind of paradox between that kind of social conservatism and an opposition to a social agenda that has been pretty successful during the last years is very important.
I wanted to ask you about that precisely, and the parallels, it seems to me, in terms of the cardinals selecting John Paul II when he was elevated to Pope. He coming out of Poland, where there was a solidarity movement and opposition to the previous government, that in essence his elevation helped to fortify that movement. I'm wondering whether there's some parallel now with the changes in Latin America now, the elevation of a very conservative cardinal from that region might help to bolster forces that are opposed to continuing this enormous change that's occurring in Latin America.
You might say so. The problem that you have there is to what extent that's gonna make the gap between the church and the Catholic followers even deeper. In the case of Argentina and some of the social issues that happened during the last decade, you see that in a country that 75% of people consider themselves Catholic, has been a strong support to some of the social decisions made by the Kirchner administration that Bergoglio opposed. The last and most important one was the same marriage law, that is matrimonio igualitario in Argentina, egalitarian marriage.
And let's talk about this, because sure. Bergoglio really took on the Argentine president in a major way. This was 2010. Then Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio led the opposition against Argentina's law that gives same-sex couples the right to marry and adopt children. Before the law passed, Bergoglio wrote a letter and addressed the monasteries in Argentina, in which he asked monks to pray fervently about a, quote, situation whose outcome can seriously harm the family. At stake are the lives of many children who will be discriminated against in advance and deprived of their human development given by a father and a mother and willed by God. At stake is the total rejection of God's law engraved in our hearts. Let us not be naive. This is not simply a political struggle, but it is an attempt to destroy God's plan, he said, about what President Christina Kirchner was pushing for, which was legalization of gay marriage.
Christina Kirchner promoted this, but it was a movement by the LGBT movement that had been going on for many years. It's an extensive social movement that the government took and put into law. And after that, Bergoglio called to a holy war, una guerra de Dios, against this evil's move.
Is he saying that President Kirchner represented that evil?
That the law was an evil's move, so some degree of ambiguity. But it was clearly that kind of conservative message in relation to a law that A, was passed overwhelmingly after 2 months of very open and public debate, and B, the polls suggested that between 60 and 70% of people had no problem whatsoever with this kind of law. So that shows you, and he was personally involved and clearly involved in leading the opposition to this. It was the last point of several other issues, including abortion and contraception, in which Bergoglio took the side of an opposition to the administration. The most important, one of the most famous one, was when the military chaplain in 2005 said that the Minister of Health, because of the contraception policy, had to be thrown into the sea, and the government.
Bergoglio said
the military chaplain.
Oh, the military
said
chaplain.
that the government immediately asked for his remotion, and Bergoglio refused to do so, and has just waited until the priest had to retire because of his age. But it shows you the kind of how this emphasis on social justice and equality goes along with a very, very conservative stance in cultural and social issues that makes the work of the church and the relation with the followers much more difficult, and it's a challenge for them in Latin America.
Horacio Verbitsky, I'd like to ask you, you've interviewed the former Cardinal Bergoglio many times. You have a sense of him, not only his political role, but his personality. Do you have any expectations that now that he's been elevated to Pope, that he may have some change in his perspectives on some of these issues, or do you expect him to maintain the same populist conservatism that you say have marked his rise through the church hierarchy?
I do believe that he is a man. He's the man he is, and he will not change. His first days as a pope show perfectly this attitude of humility. He refused the limousine and took the bus. He asked the people to pray for him instead of praying him for them. These kind of gestures would be common in his tenure as a pope. And it's possible that he would be revered by the masses because of this different attitude that seems more democratic and less monarchical than that of the former Benedicto XVI. But in doctrinary questions, he would be tight conservative, and this is a thing that I wait, and I believe that he can play concerning Latin America and the populist governments of the region the same role that Pope John Paul played against East Europe during the first years of his tenure.
Horacio, do you think that Cardinal Bergoglio would have become Pope Francis if he hadn't played the role he did during the Dirty Wars? If he had sided with these two Jesuit priests who were speaking up for the poor at the time and who were great proponents of liberation theology?
He was against liberation theology. He was a man during his tenure in the Jesuit company. The publication of the Jesuit company are full of articles, of pieces against liberation theology. Being among the poorest doesn't mean to be for the poorest. I remember a very funny thing that happened during the trial to the first military junta in 1985. The French government sent in 1979 an emissary to investigate the disappearance of French citizens in Argentina. This man, François Jérôme, talked with Almirante Chamorro, that was the chief of the main concentration camp of the Navy, ESMA. And this Admiral Chamorro told François Jérôme, who told the story to the justices in 1985, that also the church was infiltrated by communism. And as a demonstration, he cited that the new pope was Polish. Well, in the same meaning, Bergoglio is a third world pope. He comes from the third world, but he is not a partisan of the liberation theology, in the same sense in which Jean Paul came from Poland but wasn't communist.
We are going to have to leave it there. We want to thank Horacio Verbitsky for spending this hour with us, Argentine investigative journalist for Página 12, or Page 12. The newspaper in Argentina has reported extensively on the church's complicity with the military junta during the dirty wars in Argentina. And Ernesto Seman, historian at New York University, former reporter for the Argentine newspaper Clarín, as well as Página 12, where he reported on politics, human rights, as well as Bergoglio. That does it for our broadcast. Go to our website for our in-depth coverage from Argentina of the dirty wars. Go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Armando Newman, Shea, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcoff. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.